Okay, great. Right. Good afternoon again to all of you, and welcome to the second webinar of the 2020-2021 EPRC seminar program. My name is Wilbert Den Hoed, and I'm a postdoctoral researcher at EPRC, based at our Delft location in the Netherlands. It's my pleasure to chair this seminar today. In normal circumstances, these seminars would have taken place face-to-face at the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow, which we hopefully look forward again to do in the future. Nonetheless, today we are very happy to welcome you from different parts of the world in this webinar, and hopefully in future webinars as well. Today we have a highly topical presentation by Dr. Diana Valero Lopez on narrative policies about rurality in Europe and the populist challenges for the rural-urban divide. Before introducing our speaker any further, I would just quickly like you to inform that the meeting is being recorded, which means that you and your colleagues will have the opportunity to recap the meeting at a later stage. The recording will be available on our YouTube channel and shared with you by email. And we would also like you to encourage using Twitter to share your thoughts on the webinar. Our speaker will do a presentation of around 20 to 30 minutes, after which we'll have a Q&A with you. And we aim to finish by 1 p.m. UK time. I'm sure you by now will be all familiar with the protocol for Zoom meetings and other online meetings, so I won't need to tell a lot about the protocol. Just a reminder to keep your microphone on mute if you're not speaking. And if you want to make an intervention or ask a question that we will get back to afterwards, please use the blue hand or use the chat function to send any comments, questions, etc. That we'll save for the Q&A. So today's speaker, Diana Valero Lopez, is a social scientist who studies territorial and social cohesion with a strong focus on rural areas. She has a background in policy analysis and has a specific interest in social sustainability and governance in rural areas. In particular, she studies the reconfiguration of social practices, policy narratives, and participatory processes as drivers of positive transformative change. Her doctoral research explored the diversity of policy actions tackling social exclusion in rural areas in Spain. And after completing her PhD, she moved to Scotland and worked at the Centre for Mountain Studies at the University of the Highlands and Islands in a number of European projects about sustainability, rural development, with a strong focus on stakeholder engagement. Since April 2020, Diana continues her postdoctoral career at the University of Stirling, the Faculty of Natural Sciences, studying the factors shaping their land management choices of farmers through behavioral experimental games. Today, she will pick up the highly relevant topic of far-right populist movements across Europe, using her experience with policy and media analysis around populist challenges and the rural-urban divide. So without further ado, I think, Diana, the floor is yours. And if you would like to share your screen, that would be great. Thank you.
Thanks, Wilbert. Let me share my screen here. I think you should be able to, can you see it well?
Yeah. Yes.
So thanks, first of all, thanks a lot to Wilbert and Liliana for inviting me to participate in these EPRC seminars, and apologies for the delay. I had troubles connected to Zoom today. So as Wilbert was saying, I'm going to talk about narrative policies about rurality in Europe and how it links with radical right populist movements, and what are the challenges that impose to the rural-urban divide. This is quite a personal project for me. It's something I've been working on during the last couple of years. It's a small project on the side, so any comment will be extremely welcome. So I'm going to talk a bit about why I look into narratives of rurality and narrative policies, a bit about the methods, and then I will explore two case studies, one about narratives across Europe and one focusing in Spain, and then some key ideas. So first, why looking into narratives about rurality? Well, if we go back to 2016 for a moment, that year, we know, so after Brexit results, after the Trump victory, there were a lot of stories in the media linking those results directly to the vote of rural population. So that made me think, okay, wait, what is happening here? Because looking at the results were not so clear as the narrative were being. So that's one of the reasons why I thought, okay, maybe it's time to look at what are we telling about rural areas. And this is important when talking about populism, because populism is, as all of you know, it's a highly performative political project, which is based mainly on a narrative of articulating two elements, the people versus the elite, and we will see how this articulates around rural areas. When talking about narratives, we're talking about stories around a topic that are continuously repeated, and that are shared and that are amplified by people in power, but by media, and that they are believed to be true. And they are social constructs, but this storytelling contributes at the same time to construct other social constructs, as it could be rurality. So we can look at them as meta-narratives. So they are stories that are building what we think about issues as important as what rurality is and what rurality means. And they also trigger social imagination, which is critical, particular in liminal moments, like the one we are living nowadays, to envision pathways. So what are the things that we as society have to do, what the governments can do to face the big global challenges that society faces at the moment. So this is also relevant when envisioning possible rural futures. And it is timely relevant right now when the EU is in a process of definition of a long-term vision for rural areas. So the methods that I've used to look into narratives of rurality are delving mainly on qualitative analysis of media pieces, and I use the narrative policy framework developed by Shanahan and collaborators in the United States. So this framework talks specifically about narrative policies. So focus on policy stories that are formulated to influence public opinion and to support a specific political preference. So from now on, when I talk about narratives, I will be talking about narrative policies, just to make it short that I will say narratives. And these frameworks looks into narrative policies and the elements that they have in a very operational way. So they say that there are at least two, these narratives have at least two elements always. A policy stance that is a specific political program, and also a story character, which is very simple. It's links to traditional storytellings, is that the elements of villains, victims, and heroes. So a narrative will have at least one of those story characters and a policy stance. as I was saying, I look into media pieces mainly. So media pieces are a good source for narratives, and I use Google News to collect this pieces, which brings obviously some limitations to the research. And I use two different strategies for the two case studies. First, looking into narrative of rurality in Europe, I focused in the period 2015-2019. So I made searches looking for the labels in the screen, and I had until I had a corpus of 144 pieces that comprises a wide range of political process and events, including Brexit and the subsequent debates, general elections in the UK, France, Spain, farmers' protests in Romania, France, Slovakia, general protests in Poland, Hungary, Romania, the Yellow Vest revolt in France, the Emptying Spain revolt in Spain, and also a wide range of rural development issues, including housing, farming subsidies, provision of services, broadband, food policy, food production, environmental policies, protected areas, etc. And then there's the second case study. I look in particular, I focus in the narratives that were being produced by a radical right populist party in Spain, this Vox, around the electoral the elections of April 2019. So the corpus in this case was a corpus looking into rural Spain around the election, and it resulted in almost 1,500 pieces of news. For this analysis in particular, I focus only in the ones that were focusing only on Vox, and that was only the 2.7% of that corpus, a total of 33 pieces. So starting with the what did I find in the narratives in Europe? So, well, first there were narratives in all the spectrum, looking into how rural areas and rural population was characterized, depending on those story character elements. I found there were some narratives that were proposing depicting rural areas as heroes, some depicting rural areas as victims, and some depicting rural areas as villains. I must say, I'm afraid rural areas as heroes were the less representative type, and I will go back to that to the end. By far the most extended one, the most extended narrative, up to 66% of the, so 2/3 of the whole corpus were depicting rural areas as victims. And specifically the narrative focusing on the abandonment and marginalization of rural areas were more than half of the sample. And within this type of narrative, claiming for more public intervention was more than a quarter of the total sample. So we can see now the dominance of this narrative of abandonment. But also there were narratives looking at rural areas as villains to be blamed because of environmental issues or because of the failure of some policies, but also because of the success of specific political projects linked to nativism ideas, and also the overrepresentation of rural areas in national elections, and those link with the success of populist movements. So depending a bit more on how rural areas are depicted as victims, as I was saying, is the most recurrent narrative. And the line is that rural areas are victims of modernization and abandonment by public policies. The government will have forgotten rural areas, and the policy stance claims for the need of more investment in those areas, particularly through services. There are variations on this narrative. Some of them were focusing on a specific demographic consequences of marginalizations. For instance, the particularly vulnerable position of rural women and how they are affected more by the lack of services and sometimes pushed to out-migration, generating more gender imbalances in rural areas, but also the consequences for overage population. There were as well narratives that focus on specific topics, like the need for creating affordable housing to attract young people, for instance, and also how critical mobility is in rural areas when there is a lack of transportation. Also, so those narratives are depicting rural areas as victims of a passive abandonment. But there are some narratives that depict rural areas as well as victims of measures that are imposed without taking into account the needs of rural areas, and that they will be claiming for some kind of rural proofing, because if not, they could trigger rebellion. And I found some of those narratives in the farmers' protests in France and the Yellow Vest protests as well, but also in the protests in Central and Eastern Europe, that they were blaming mainly European policies in this case. And last but not least, rural areas appear as well as victims at risk of becoming places just of nostalgia that are not understood by the urban population, what could mean, what could bring that measures that they are not be taking into account rural needs, and that they will be claiming for programs of education and cultural exchange. Moving into rural areas as villains, these narratives depict rural population as the ones to be blamed for the electoral successes of far-right and populist movements in national elections, but also for provoking the failure of post-materialistic policies, like it was the fuel tax in France around the Yellow Vest protests. So rural population is characterized as opposing to the spread of ideas of equality that will undermine traditional values, and that was one of the narratives found, for instance, in the protest against the protest for the measures against the LGBT community in Poland. And in some cases, they are linked. This narrative links this feature to the age of the population, particularly in the populated areas in Romania and Spain. Also, rural population are described as protesters who feel culturally left behind, and that's the case why they rebel against the measures, like the case, as I was saying, of the Yellow Vest revolts. But mainly the core is that they are suspected of voting radical right and populist national center political parties. And they are voting this aligned with those nativist agendas, so protecting the national identity against cosmopolitan projects. And this narrative, a variation of this narrative, says this is really dangerous because of the overrepresentation of rural areas in the electoral systems, and the political stance claims for electoral reforms that minimize the representation of rural areas, and that happened so that's a narrative found in Spain and Hungary. There is also some feedback between narratives. There is overlapping of the narratives in the media pieces, and there is, as you will have realized by now, there is overlapping in the content of the narratives. There is a significant spread, as I was saying, of the narrative of abandonment, emphasizing the need for public intervention. It underpins another number of victim narrative variations, like I was saying, the one focusing on single topics, like mobility, or focusing on gender issues, but also it's the background for some of the narratives looking into describing rural population as villains and blaming the success of populist movements. So in the graph, you can say how the links of the narrative of abandonment, which is one in purple, it spreads in other narratives, configuring itself like a meta-narrative. In the Spanish, so the Spanish case study, once I decided, okay, it's time to look into how populist parties articulate actually those narratives. So I look into the case of Vox in the election, in the national election in 2019 in Spain. And it's a relevant case because first, this election the electoral campaign was kicked off by, in the context of the revolt of the MT in Spain, which were a series of demonstrations vindicating the situation of the populated areas, what put rural areas in the electoral agenda. And also because the results of this electoral process, as a result of this electoral process, is the first time since the 70s that a far-right political party gets seats in the Spanish parliament, and it was Vox. So Vox in the narratives of rurality, the narrative of rurality that Vox deploys, it has the three narrative elements quite clear. First is the victim rural population as the victim of abandonment and being forgotten by the government and of inequality process, so which make rural population in a worse situation than urban inhabitants and people who living in cities. It's particularly a victim of the population processes and services. They highlight all the time how bad transport services are. But also they include another element, which are wildlife conflicts. So rural population, and particularly farmers in certain areas, will be victims of rewilding policies that will have consequences in wildlife attacks to livestock. So the villains, aligned with this, there are two villains for Vox. One is the government, regional government, central government, current governments, past governments, any government, which has abandoned and marginalized rural areas, and also environmentalist groups and what they call urbanites, particularly regarding hunting practices, etc., that they don't understand, according to those, they don't understand what rural areas provide for sustainability. And the heroes, there are two heroes in their narratives. A minor hero, which is resisting that situation, who would be a group of the subset of that rural population, particularly farmers and hunters, livestock farmers. And then the central hero, which is Vox itself, the party, which will be rising as the protector of traditional lifestyles, and that links always those traditional lifestyles and rural areas to the national identity and the true culture of the country. So what? Well, this picture about how radical right populist ideas fit into the main policies of of ruralities brings some kind of complexity. But there are two ideas: that there is a pool, these narratives are a pool for populist parties to capitalize in, and that there is a potential feedback and consequences for the rural-urban divide. So first, as I've said, rural areas appear as victims of abandonment as the dominant narrative across Europe. And this is so dominant that it becomes a meta-narrative policy due to the geographical spread, the number of versions, and the connections with other narratives. We can find that this abandonment and marginalization of rural areas is the dominant meta-narrative in Europe at the moment. And this is an important field for radical right populist parties to capitalize on. First, because it places rural population aligned with these theories of left behind places, losers of globalizations, which, as we know, they have been described as the pool of supporters of populist projects. Also, it illustrates perfectly that societal divide characteristic of populist movements, that the people versus the elite. In this case, it's rural people versus the governments and political parties and the urbanites. And this is also this is articulated quite clearly, for instance, in the case of works, I was saying before. But also at the same time, it frames rural areas within the cultural backlash, because the rural areas are abandoned and they feel marginalized. They might vote for populist parties, and this feeds the hostility towards rural areas. And also the cultural backlash is quite obvious regarding the hostility towards environmental issues and that disregard for materialist values that was seen in the Yellow Vest protest, but could be seen as well in the protests in Poland. So as I was saying, this means a potential feedback on the growing rural divide. There is already existing a shadow that rural areas support radical right populism. And even some of the victim narratives already assume that the rural population voting for those projects are being manipulated because of the populist solutions. So the narrative is they are being manipulated, they are victims, or they are villains that they have to be blamed, they are blamed. So that could mean a backlash of feelings. Rural population can feel disapproved and misunderstood, and so feedback this cultural backlash and growing the urban rural divide could be a self-fulfilling prophecy. So some final comments to conclude and summarize. There is a complex narrative of fabric across about rural areas in Europe, but there is a clear dominance of the narrative of abandonment. And this is a pool for radical right populist parties to capitalize in, because it aligns well that it's a narrow. They represent a narrow concept of rurality, anchored exactly in that idea of abandonment. This could feed at the same time the idea of the rural-urban divide, and it could be seen perhaps as a new generation of rural-urban cleavages linked to the new cleavages around center and peripheries. And it may have important consequences for policies towards the global challenges based on value-based priorities, particularly towards environmentalist policies or social policies. So there's potential for further research here which I think would be very interesting, looking at the political impacts on the cultural feedback, and looking more into that relationship, but also to compare the specific articulation of how radical right populist parties capitalize on the narrative of abandonment in the different countries. And this is something that cannot be done in English. It's something that it has to be done at the local languages, and the languages that the stories are told. And this links with the note that I wanted to make about the hero narratives. What is their role? And I feel that one of the, particularly when looking into comparing the results of the European study to the Spanish study, I realized that there are narratives of rural areas that depict rural areas as hero at local level. But because they are local stories, they are told in local languages, and they are not picked up by international outlets. So is it possible to build a meta-narrative of rural areas as heroes that is common across Europe? That's something that it will be interesting to look at as well. And that's it. So I'm very happy to, I hope that you find it interesting, and I'm looking forward to the discussion and your questions.
Okay, thank you, Diana. This was indeed very interesting, hearing these really like geographical imaginations about constructed about rurality. Sorry, and a very interesting use of these storytelling components like heroes, villains, victims. I would now like to open the floor for any questions. Please feel free to ask them in the chat, or by simply unmuting and asking them now.
Hi everyone. Hi Diana. This is Yahoo. I'm so happy to hear you again after Belgium, after Brussels last year. So I really enjoyed your presentation. I think definitely it's very, very interesting and it's very topical. So first I have a comment. So I think when we do narrative studies, since it's really a very dynamic phenomenon and it's ever changing, I mean, driven by socio-economic trends. Like now, I think there are also new elements in this narrative, so, which come from external. Like in Europe, especially in Southern European countries, you have very, very evident and pronounced, refugee crisis, no? So like here, I'm now based in Calabria, it's in Southern Italy. So like you said, there is this abandonment, but meanwhile, there is also this refueling, so coming from the refugees. So I also did a part of my field studies in rural areas in Calabria. What I found is many refugees, they occupied those abandoned houses, and they also started doing participating in local productivity activities. So how can we always, let's say, get to know these new narratives, and are the media or the policymakers, they are also considering this kind of narratives? And also another question is I think now, since everything changes so fast, how can we envision let's say for the next programming period, and what do you think the narrative will change or transform? Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Hi, Ben. Many thanks for the comments. It's really nice to hear you again as well. Absolutely agree. Absolutely on your point that narratives are a very dynamic phenomenon, particularly because I don't know. It's because this moment of liminality that we are seeing a lot of competing narratives. And also in a year like this one with the pandemic, we have seen a new set of narratives arising around rural areas, quite with a lot of potential. Some of them looking into the possibilities, or looking into rural areas as better places to live in. So looking into the possibilities for development, although not all type of rural areas. Also, I'm very interested in what you were mentioning about the situation in Calabria and how some of those abandoned places are being repopulated. So narratives of in some way almost gentrification as well of rural areas, but a repopulation. We know they are happening. Some of them, they are linked to COVID. Some of them come from behind. And the issue now, one of the questions that pop into my mind is, are they local narratives, or they have potential, or do they, at what point those narratives become global, even if building on local cases, and at what point they just stay as local stories, local tales. So regarding about how to pick up the new narratives, I'm actively thinking about how to use social media to pick up those narratives instead of media. We know that social media and platforms like Twitter allow to reproduce some narratives very, very fast and at a larger scale. And this has been capitalized as well for populist political projects, but not only populist projects. So a way to pick up those new narratives could be looking into social media, I think. And regarding about how to envision at the moment, well, I don't know. The EU has the European Commission started a process precisely to envision a long-term plan for rural areas. So I don't know how it's going to be. My feeling after working into this for the last couple of years is that it could be a tale of rural areas, capitalizing mainly as rural areas as hero, because something that I haven't said is that the rural areas as hero, it's a narrative that it builds on the European policies of rural development. So looking something that depicts rural areas as heroes, and as heroes saving from their own marginalization or abandonment. But that's just I guess.
Yeah, I really like the 2 points you made just now. So one point you made is about the local narrative and the global narrative or the national narrative. I think maybe we should also pay more attention to how the local population, how the rural population, they are narrating themselves, how they identify their life or situation. So this is also very important. Sometimes I think from externals, the narratives can be biased or like imaginary. I mean, it's like an imagined rural narrative. And also, you also mentioned the second point. I think it's very, very interesting is to replace media with social media. So I think in this social media, I think what is so important is now the emergent self-media. So like the local people as the protagonists, protagonists to narrate themselves. This is very important because I think global-wise, I don't know if it's global-wise, but I think in Europe now you also have a shrinking middle class population due to continuous crises and these kind of things. So, but the media normally I think is represented by the elite, by the middle class, let's say. So in the end, since the middle class, the recipient of the media, the middle class, it's shrinking. And then I think there will be like information asymmetry between what is produced by the media and the middle class. That's why I think now it's so important to how say pay more attention or to facilitate the self-media to address this information asymmetry. This is only what I'm hypothesizing. I don't know if it's really scientific, but thank you for your for your response just now.
Thank you, Yapeng. This was fascinating, and then maybe we can even have almost have another seminar about this topic because it's really a lot of ground to cover. Coming back a bit to Diana's conclusions, I had myself a short question maybe about something you touched upon there was the implications for social and environmental policies. And at the start of your presentation, you mentioned the link to the EU long-term vision for rural areas. And related to maybe what Yapeng said as well, is this dynamic nature of the narrative, of narratives around rural areas. Do you think, or is there a way that such like a long-term policy or a vision can capture this really ongoing dynamic process that is sometimes changing within very short time?
I think that's a super relevant question. The importance of the narratives is that they have potential to underpin other processes because they become frames in which they can become frames in which those processes are deployed. So in a way, it can act like ideologies. So in rural studies, we have talked it has been talked for a long time about the ideology of the rural ideal. So it seems like we could have been, so this narrative of abandonment could be a substitute or a competing narrative with the idea of the rural ideal. And the idea is that other things that come, the situations that come, sometimes foreseen, sometimes not, like the pandemic, are being framed not in a blank page, but within that story that is already there. So I've seen, for instance, in Spain, how these ideas of the opportunities for rural areas, so within this idea of the abandoned, they are taking the narrative of the abandonment of rural Spain and the emptying Spain, and they are building there the opportunities that COVID-19 is bringing for the populated areas. So I feel that the rural, a long-term rural vision, as is not specific to the detail of the policies, which is not, because I suppose it will be, it won't, because narratives are just stories that set the frame for something to develop, or for, and narrative policies specifically, they are setting the frame for policy programs to be able to be developed, but not up to, and they could be very specific, but long term they could be quite wide. And they, yeah, so they can be, there can be, there will be always be competing narratives. I feel. I'm sorry, I cannot answer more specifically to the question.
No, that's fine. That was already very helpful. Maybe someone else has a question already. I saw Stefan put in an interesting map of the US elections. Of course, we cannot maybe not mention that today discussing this topic. Would you like to say something more about that, Stefan? There you are, yeah.
Yes, sorry, I missed the first part, and you might have already mentioned this. I just thought, whatever you talked about, every slide, I had this the United States situation in my mind all the time. And I know this is not the focus of your work. It's not really a question. I just thought it was interesting to see how relevant this is globally. That's not a European issue. Small comment or question.
I know, thanks Stefan a lot. Actually, that was one of the triggers for me starting to look into narrative, into these narratives of rurality, and it was in 2016, after the elections of Trump, and also after Brexit, where the two, and how were the two triggers, seeing how those successes were traced back to rural areas and how they were reproduced in the media. What got me thinking about, okay, what is going on here? And there is a super interesting amount of literature being published in the last couple of years, comparing as well the US case with the situation in other parts of Europe. The thing is that there are, again, it picks up in two elements that I've mentioned as well in Europe. One is the electoral system, and those in the US, particularly because of the elections last week, we have heard a lot about the reform of the electoral college, etc. And that happens in every other country, that, like Spain or Romania, that has elections, and then they have an unforeseen, or not so unforeseen right now, electoral success for populist parties. But then when looking in depth into this, there are as well articles, so there are as well analyses that say, yes, there is a link between the rural support, but it's not so overwhelming. And seeing the map that you have put has also reminded me about another debate that I saw on Twitter last week, which was about the visualization of electoral results in maps, and how those tell as well different narratives of the same process, because they can put more the focus on the rural areas or rural counties or not. So yeah, sometimes we forgot, so because that images are also very, very powerful narratives.
Sorry, do you mean this discussion about, or this map was changing shape, and then it said it's people are voting, not places. That's the one.
Exactly. Yeah, I think that was the map that triggered that discussion.
Yes, this the exact same map, and this was a few years ago, and you probably have mentioned this in the earlier parts when I wasn't there. It was the Austrian election for president of the Austrian president, which is a directly done direct election, and the map looked exactly the same. It was all in one color, with the cities being the other color. So it was, if you just look at the surface, you say 95% for the one candidate, but still the other one won. So it's a bit like the US map. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks again, both. I'm seeing another question by Louis about the maybe application of your points in the UK. Would you like to ask this yourself, Louis?
Yeah, no problem. Hi, everyone. Yeah, so a very interesting presentation. So I think what I want to know more on in terms of research is the extent to which, you know, the long-term deindustrialization, the shift to urbanization within Western Europe and in the UK has influenced this kind of new narrative of this dynamic between rural and urban views on how the world should be and how the economy should move forward, and how that's kind of influenced the Brexit vote as well. I just wanted to know if you're considering that at all in the research and to what extent you are.
Thanks, Luis. Yeah, absolutely. That those elements were examples that were illustrating the narrative of abandonment. It was impossible to describe all the situations that were included in those narratives. But yeah, one of them is the process of desindustrialization, linking with the descriptions of rural areas, the understandings of rural areas as left behind places, which is something that rural studies and regional science has already looked into in there. So yeah, that's part of the abandonment and marginalization narrative, linked mainly to those modernizations. So rural population who felt off-bound. So it's like the process of development in the countries is leaving them without options. So this is the process why they become victims. And they become left behind. So yeah, I mean, I would love to. I'm not looking at the moment in depth into how this has been developed, but it's something that it would be absolutely interesting to look at how the whole how has been the process for this narrative to become the meta-narrative that it is now.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it's a historical process that's emerged over decades, really. You know, since fundamental shifts in the 70s and 80s and this deindustrialization process, that's what's enabled this narrative to emerge more recently. Accompanied with that, with the kind of public mistrust of national governments, especially in the UK, over time, and it's kind of cemented that narrative and cemented that ideology almost in certain parts. But yeah, very interesting topic.
Absolutely agree.
Okay, I see we're coming close to 1 o'clock UK time at least. Maybe there's room for one small short question. And if not, I think we're moving to the end of today's seminar. Well, I would first of all like to thank Diana and also the audience and the ones that asked these questions to get the discussion ongoing. Thank you very much. We have a next webinar already next week on the 18th with Dr. Bryony Goodwin Hawkins, who will present on regionalizing spatial justice. Also, future EPRC webinars this autumn will delve into topics of regional policy and development. If you're interested in this, please use the same contact email that you've used to register this time, and keep an eye on our mailing list and our Twitter account to keep track of our future events.